82. That's the current age of the youngest Cuban that participate in the last free, fair, and multi-party elections we had on the island. Why? Because in 1959, an armed group came to power through force. Actually, they defeated the dictator that was in power since 1952. But they established a communist military regime that has kept the country under the control of a single family and the same group of generals for 57 years now. Because of this dictatorship, the whole population have been forced into poverty and live without the most basic human rights. Almost the 20% of the Cubans live in the exile, and many, thousands, have died trying to escape the island. But one of the most frightening sins of a totalitarian regime is that they are always in expansion. And the Cuban intelligence apparatus and the propaganda machine has been one of the determining factors that contribute to the deterioration of the democracy in the region, especially in countries like Venezuela. And please don't underestimate this. Don't underestimate the influence, the toxicity, and the interference of a totalitarian regime. I could tell you, for instance, that yesterday, the president of the Puerto Rican Senate just proposed Raúl Castro, the current general in power in Cuba, for the Nobel Peace Prize. In the meanwhile, we cannot choose the way we want to live our life. We cannot say what we wish. We cannot even choose our job after university. In fact, the Cuban Constitution states that the communist one-party system is irrevocable, and that the provision that arbitrarily established that rule cannot be changed, never, by anyone, not even by the National Assembly, not even by the generals in power. But the Constitution cannot be above the will of the people. It requires the consent of the people. And it's precisely that, the consent of the people, what the Cuban regime has ever had. They have remained in power by force. But I know a greater force, and it is called citizen participation. And we are combining these two factors, the will of the people and the citizen involvement, in a campaign called Cuba Decide, Cuba Decides. We are creating a movement on and off the island to advocate for the Cubans' right to decide their own future. We want to hold a plebiscite in Cuba in favor of a proposal to change to a multi-party and democratic system. Of course, we need international presence in the island. We need access to the media on the island. We need to be able to count the votes in a parallel way to the authorities. But before asking for your support to this campaign, before asking for your support to start a transition process in Cuba and change history, I would like to start by telling you a little bit about my story. This is my father, Oswaldo Payá. This man dedicates his life to promote human rights. Actually, his goal was that all Cubans could pursue happiness in the way that they determine. And in the middle of this peaceful fight, He was killed 4 years ago. But I consider myself a privileged woman because I got to know Oswaldo Payá not just as a thinker, not just as a Democrat, but as my loving father. And he was the kind of person you want to be close to. Of course, we were a family suffering under a totalitarian regime. And we were suffering a lot of tensions, but I always tell the same story because even when we had this difficult situation in Cuba, my friends in the school and even in the university kind of envy me because I could be free. I could be free in my house, and my father taught us, my brothers and I, how to carry that freedom in our minds and in our actions. So I could say whatever I want. And my friends, they had to pretend to defend the revolution out of fear. But we could say whatever we think. My father always told us, you have to say what you think, and we'll take care of it later. So I have the privilege of growing up as a free person in the middle of a society that is not. My father was the founder of the Varela Project. So far, the only independent and massively supported legal petition in favor of human rights in the island. He not just espoused the regime, he proposed a solution to democratically transform the system for the better. His work earned him many honors. He was a Sakharov Prize winner. He also was 5 times nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize. And the government realized that Oswaldo Payá embodied the National Assembly because he had a proposal, and his proposal was constitutional and used the rules of the regime against the regime itself. I started to work with him when I was in the university. We started working in a newsletter. I was part of a group of young people working in a newsletter, and I just want to draw your attention to this guy. His name is Harold Cepero. He was working with us in the newsletter. Actually, the first edition of the newsletter was set to be published the day that he and my father were killed. And I want you to know a quote of the article that Harold wrote and didn't live to see it published. Harold wrote, "Those Cubans who dares to confront the regime, those Cubans to dare to join the democratic opposition or the civil society, those Cubans that dare to live in truth, they are risking loneliness, isolation, prison, or death." And that was what happened to him and to my father 4 years ago. And years later, we are still asking for an independent investigation. But I can tell you what I know that happened. I can tell you what we know for sure that happened based on the few evidence that we could collect. My father and Harold were traveling in a car together with 2 foreign friends, and a car from the state security followed them. At some point of the road, the state security car hit the car of my father and running off the road. Immediately after, the Cuban state security agents took the 2 foreigners and my friend Harold to the hospital and was there in the hospital where my friend Harold Cepero, 32 years old, one of the brilliant minds that I have ever met, died, abandoned. The system and the regime refused medical attention to Harold Cepero. My father remained in the crime scene and was probably there where the agents of the Cuban state security execute him. My family have been suffering repression for a while now. I remember feeling this mix of proud and embarrassment when my mother first took me to see the front of my house. I was 8, maybe 9 years old. The state security vandalized our home as a warning to my father. This word there, gusano, it means worm. That's the label that the Cuban regimes use to name those who dare to confront the system. And the last year of the life of my father was a particularly frightening one. My father suffered at least 2 potentially deadly attacks. The first one was in his workplace. An oxygen pipe exploded just as he touched it, in a very mysterious way. The second one was a month and a half before his killing. A car crashed into his car, and it was by pure miracle, by providence, that my mother and my father didn't die that day. Actually, this picture was taken a few moments after the attack occurred. But the real goal of the regime was not just to kill my father, was to kill his legacy. That's why they continue the harassment against my family. That's why they continue the threats and the attacks against the family and against the whole opposition movement. I just want you to show you what happened to me like 2 years ago in Geneva, in United Nations, when the Cuban ambassador interrupted me in the moment that I was talking about the case of my father.
Sala, pero era necesario interrumpir la intervención de la mercenaria que ha osado venir a esta sala. Y queremos preguntarle, señor presidente, si este debate del tema 4 es para referirse a cuestiones generales que puedan demostrar un patrón de violaciones de derechos humanos o también se presta para abordar cuestiones específicas como lo está haciendo la mercenaria que está haciendo uso de la palabra en este momento. Tenemos esa inquietud, señor presidente, y nos agradeceríamos que nos las aclare y que también ilustre a la mercenaria que está haciendo esta intervención. Muchas gracias.
Mercenary, that's the label they use to name us out of the country. But just pay attention to this. If these guys, if the Cuban regime is able to be so despotically open in the middle of the United Nations, in the middle of a Human Rights Council in Geneva, what they are capable of doing to silence the Cuban people inside the island. But you know what? The Cuban people don't want to be silenced. We want to have a voice, just as each of you has a voice here. That's why we are launching this campaign. That's why we want to hold a plebiscite in the island, because we want to provide the Cuban people with a tool to make the participation actionable and to make the beginning of the transition process peaceful and institutional. That's why I'm asking for your support to this campaign and asking you that support the right that we, as a people, have to determine the future of our nation. In these times when Obama, Mick Jagger, Paris Hilton, even the Pope walk by the streets of Havana, we have to understand that the totalitarian regime already learned that they don't have to look so totalitarian. They don't have to look so rude. Actually, they are using the symbols of the free world to pretend a transition without actually changing at all. So I ask you to engage with Cuba, but engage following the advice that my father gave a few years before. He said, if you want to extend a helping hand to the Cuban people, you should first ask for the Cubans to have their hands untied. So, support our right to decide and to determine our own future. Support Cuba Decide campaign. Go to our website, cubadecide.org, and sign the petition of support. Urge your representative to pass a resolution in Congress supporting the right to decide of the Cuban people. This is not a partisan thing. This is a human, a basic issue. Spread the voice of the campaign. Share it in social media. Ask for the Cubans the same rights and the same freedom that you enjoy today. Thank you so much.